Great stuff. Thank you very much for that, Catherine. Hopefully this will be a wild entertainment, perhaps, that we'll be able to give here. And what I intend to do for just 15-20 minutes is to whiz through the two projects, a bit about what we've done, the platforms, and about them in general, then a couple of ways that team members have used them. And I'm going to start with the Who Are the Nuns project, and then move on to Monks in Motion, which is newer, and we're about to do some number analysis with that. So I'll touch upon some of the stuff that we're looking at doing with. Now, the first thing to talk about is the English convents in exile, which is the basis for the Who Are the Nuns project. And after the Reformation in England, everyone talks about the lack of male houses and the exile movement. But what there's been a lot of research in with the last decade or so has been the unprecedented movement of English women to continental Europe, mainland Europe. And there they set up a series of convents. There was the first one at Brussels, a Benedictine house in 1598, and it was followed by another 21 establishments. We should also mention that that's not counting the Lisbon Bridgetine convent, that's not on this map, which was a continuation from pre-Reformation, nor is it counting the Mary Ward sisters, who are slightly different. We're not going to get too much into that today. But the first thing to say just about what it actually achieved. Oh, sorry, I should just say as well, the map here shows where a number of those convents were, and you can see there's different orders in particular cities. For example, Paris, you can see there's three communities there, the Conceptionists, the Benedictines, and the Augustinians, just as an example. But what we found with the Who Are the Nuns project going on it is that we were able to increase the number of women who were known about who entered these English convents in any way, shape or form. So previously it was thought there was about 1,800, about 1,800, but we managed to find just under 4,000 in total. So a huge increase in the numbers that we were able to find there, thanks to the database system. And now what I want to do is show some of the material that we drew that from to be able to track these women and find them before we entered them into the database, and then some of the stuff we could do with the database. And so just to give you an idea that the archives and material we had to use were from all different types of sources, and they were spread widely across public and private archives. And what we've got here is from the Maryland State Archives. And this is an obituary book. So what we could get here that perhaps you can't find in other sources is not just the name that you can see there, Sister Anne of St. Joseph, who was a lay sister, but her name in life, if you like, before profession, which isn't always recorded so obviously if you come across Carmelite material, which this is from. It's from, by the way, the Maryland State Archive, because it's from the English Carmelite convent, that the first English-speaking convent is founded in America, or what will become the US, in the late 80s. These obituary books can give us all sorts of things, where she's buried, names that we can see there, how she entered. You can also find other piece of information. I can remember going to a Carmelite convent that was still in existence and being showed the obituary book, and there was a particular story about one nun who it was recorded she died while she was cleaning the giant crucifix on the altar, which fell on her. And I was reading this and thought it was a slightly darkly, dare one say, darkly comic. But I can remember then being bought by one of the nuns and shown the huge crucifix that they'd managed to bring with them from the Low Countries back to Darlington. And it was just pointing and saying, that's the large crucifix you just read about that crushed poor sister, whoever she was. I wasn't quite sure how I was supposed to take it, but it shows how the different things interplay with each other. And there is scope to do things like material culture databases that you can find within these documents. So that's one sort of document we had. We also had to deal with things like the state archives, the Ghent bishopric. Here we can see this is finding out if this particular woman, Claire Throckmorton, she is joining the convent of her own volition. So this is from when the Bishop of Ghent or one of his representatives would have quizzed her before she entered. We have things like financial records that we had to draw from to find out, for example, dowries. We didn't in the end record them all because it was quite harder to do it, but we did record it in certain instances. But what we did record were particular roles that they held in the convent. So what you can see here is Mother Elizabeth Meynell, who was the procuratrix, or we might call the bursar, and here she is presenting the financial records. So we were able to record that was her job and for which years she did that. If you're interested in Jacobites, the bit below is recording that this particular convent, the Paris Augustinians, held the heart of Earl of Derwentwater, who led the 1715 Jacobite rising. And this is paying for a mass that's going to be round his relic by his widow. We also had things like these, which are, we have profession documents. Again, we can get here things like fathers, which we recorded. So you could begin searching for networks that were going on and relations. And finally, just on the sources we had for this, we had added things that would tell us about who was there and what we might call nearly nuns, we nicknamed them, which are kind of harder to track because you have to find just references to them hidden away. Apart from in this particular chapter book, actually still recorded them. They'd often disappear. And this is for the canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre who were at Liège. And we can see here that Sister Mary Joseph Tempest, she was accepted for clothing and was clothed, but the cross indicates she never went forward for profession. So we were able to record her. We were lucky that all of these actually only had a cross in. Apart from one, there was one nun we couldn't read and she was completely scribbled and scrawled out, and it just said gone to join the Poor Clares, which clearly they considered was the worst crime you could ever do. Not just becoming a layperson was fine, but joining the Poor Clares was obviously a step beyond. And that names only a few of the scattered sources that we were able to tap for these things and how they moved about. And that's all partly because of the French Revolution, when they fled back to England, a lot of these institutions. So some stuff ended up in local sources, if that's where they were effectively taken by the authorities, or they managed to come back to England. Some still with the communities, some now in public or other private. Now, what I just wanted to do just a little is to show you that something that I worked on, how we can use those numbers. So I want to get away from the idea that a prosopographical database is just nerdy listing, but what we can actually do with it. And what I was interested in was recruitment, particularly to a county. And so this is just a chart that I drew up with particular things in mind, showing entry levels for each convent in particular decades. And what I wanted to begin looking at was the influence of particular networks or spiritual networks, or is it patronage networks, on convent recruitment. And I was interested in Essex. And Essex is traditionally known for its Protestant leanings. But when we looked at the figures, it became clear that there was a pretty significant number of women going to the convents from Essex, one that rises in the first half century and then dips, never really recovers in the Restoration period, but certainly dips quite badly afterwards. But these are higher numbers than we would be thinking for Essex. That during the first half of the 17th century, as I said, it's far higher than we expect. And prior to and during the Civil War, Essex was supplying 5 to 6% of convent recruits. And that's just when we were able to test it, nuns whose fathers were from Essex or they were born there. If we include mothers from Essex, which of course could be another influence level, it goes even higher. But 1 in 20 is still much higher than would have been expected from Essex, with what's usually referred to about. Now, when we look at where they're going, these particular convents, we can also see that they have a particular Jesuit leaning. Okay, so they're going to Jesuit supporting convents. And we can see, for example, something like the Brussels Benedictines starts strong, but then collapses. And this is because we know that the Brussels Benedictines has a shift away from Jesuit influence. And so the next thing I was able to do then using the database was to have a look at how we can do this if we map it onto what was called a Jesuit missionary college at the time. And this is the College of the Holy Apostles, which covers Essex, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. And we can see the same patterns again going along. That Essex, the overall percentage is even higher. And so what I was able to track here was the influence of a Jesuit network. And actually we can see it maps on directly to one of the big Catholic families who there's a lot of convent entrance, the Peters of Thorndon and Ingatestone Hall in Essex. And actually this almost maps on directly to their own fate. So their rise, then a fall into abeyance when the 4th Lord Peter is arrested and dies in the Tower of London following the Oates plot in the later 17th century. And so that's thanks to the database, we're able to test it and to see how this plays out and to use those figures to do it. Now, what you can also find when you look on the Who and the Nuns database, you can find, for example, a lot of graphs and things that you can access and get to, and you can make come up by searching for different things. So here's estimated size of community, Also things like distribution of nuns according to social status, ages of profession, and we did some GIS stuff, which now GIS has moved on quite a lot. So this is about a decade ago, and this just shows you some of what I was talking about, the shift from East Anglia. We can see a total, if you like, collapse, 100 years later or so from what was here, or 50 years later even. And so I'm not quite brave enough to show you the database live. I thought about it. Valeria is much braver than me. So this is just to show you that. What I will show is a few things on the Monks in Motion one, which I'm just coming to now. So that's leaving behind the Who Were the Nuns and now moving to the Monks in Motion project. And I've taken just some slides and some stills to give you an example of what an entry would look like. Now, the Monks in Motion was looking this time at English Benedictines in exile, who after Jesuits and secular clergy were the biggest group of English clergy during this 250 years of exile existence. And so once again, we were hunting down from different sources, the different monks, and by including those who left the monastic life for whatever reason, as well as lay brothers and discerners, so those who turned up but then didn't go through again, we were able to increase the number of those commonly classed as Benedictine in any form by roughly a third. So again, that's a significant increase by going through like this. And what you can see is that we had to, if you have a look at the nuns one compared to this, we had to adapt how we recorded some things and find ways of doing that would still make the database fully searchable and would respond quickly, but you didn't slow it down. Basically, it's the big thing that we were very keen on. If we'd gone for even closer, tighter, it would have slowed it right down. Now, you can't see one of them here, but you can see things that, for example, we've recorded an author class, so you could search for monk authors. You can see all the details we include, their fathers, mothers, and so on. We also include quite a bit of notes. We include their offices, so you could search for the offices to find who is in charge at particular points. But we also, sorry about that, we include links. So here we can see that William Barlow, or Rudderson as he was in religion, if you click on the bottom, if you're on the database, you would go to his brother, Ambrose Barlow. And Ambrose Barlow has less on him, but you can see here that you couldn't before. You could search for him that he's a martyr, he's executed whilst in England, and you can search for his missionary activity, which we've always had a bit of a problem with. Well, it's still a problem because you have to be able to find the material, but to work out where people were active in England once they came back. And so this was one of the classes we had to add from the nuns that was a bit different. So here you could look up who was active in Lancashire in that first half century, and you would find Barlow there. Now he's just got Lancashire. Other people have got more exact places of where they were living at the time. He moved about, although as you can see, he's arrested at a particular place. And I thought it'd just be interesting to show as well, just seeing as we're talking here to a Limerick-based centre, is that within these English movements, there were ones linked to Ireland in ways, sometimes born there or with Irish parents. For the Who Were the Nuns, there were a lot more, and Mary Louise Coulihan actually has done a really great article on them that you can read about the Irish entrance to the English convents. But we've got more than we expected for the monks, who are traditionally seen as a very English movement here, of ones who've got Irish links in some way, shape or form, and some material that could be used on them. And what I just want to do in this last 5 minutes is show just a couple of ways that we've been using this material to begin to investigate certain things. Again, to show that it's not just about creating these prosopographical lists, which are great, and we get a lot of attention and visitors who are looking at family history or local history, but how we can use them and deploy this digital technology for our own research. And the first one is something that I've been effectively playing with, and it's still relatively new, and that's though with an event that happened at Valladolid in the early 17th century, or two events I should say. And we know about these events because they get out into public. We see them circulating stories of it in England, including in government Protestant-backed texts, because they plug into a bit of a fight that's going on. So it's not just an intra-Catholic problem, but one that goes much wider into the public. And that's that at the English College in Valladolid, which is Jesuit run, there is an exodus of students. Actually, there's two exodus of students to the Benedictines in Spain. And really, it's the start of the English Benedictine movement. A lot of them go to the monastery of San Benito, which is in the same city. And so I want to see why this was such a big deal, why it mattered. And thanks to the database, we're able to actually get an idea of the rates of exodus, why it mattered. Because at first they sound small, but when you look at what's happening more widely, you can see why it really affected them. And the first exodus was in 1599, and in total 24 students who entered the college in 1596, and 4 of them joined the Benedictines. That doesn't sound like much, but when we look at the rest, so 11 who entered in 1598, 8 subsequently went, 6 of them only 1 year later. So between 1596 and 1598, we're able to work out that 39 men entered English College at Valladolid, but 12 of them subsequently became Benedictines. Now, if we discount even 2 who joined slightly later on than that, we can see that it means that one in 4 of the college's entrances at this time were leaving to join the Benedictines. Now, this in itself is a significant tally, but it must have seemed even more alarming to the college authorities, as the number leaving in 1599 was only just below the number of new students arriving. So it looks like they're losing effectively a whole cohort. And when you taking, if you like, natural hemorrhaging or natural loss of people who won't go through for whatever reason, it would have seemed even higher. And we can see that again in 1603, when I was using the database able to work this out, that in 1603 we get about the same going again. We're losing about 1 in 4. So just to give you an idea that in 1603, when it really happens, the college welcomed only 6 students while losing more than double that number to the Spanish Benedictines. So you can see why it had such an impact and went wider than that, with some arguments that were happening in England. If you're interested, to do with the archpriest controversy and how that was used by the authorities in England. But it shows again the numbers that are going. And I just want to talk about one final one. I'm just flashing up here the website so you can go and look. And that's some work being done by my colleague on the Monks in Motion project, Cormac Begaden, who would have been here today in the audience, but he says he's got to have some root canal treatment, which seems a pretty desperate way of getting out of listening to this. And he was looking at numbers of Benedictines. It's always been assumed that these English exile institutions were dying out before the French Revolution. Effectively, the French Revolution saves them. But by comparing the different numbers entering before the last half century, so from 1750 onwards to the numbers entering between 1700 and 1750, he can see that there's no pattern of terminal decline, which has always been what's been assumed. And in fact, he finds that they're almost exactly the same numbers going on, apart from one particular house. So he's been able to look instead at this idea of decline and what it actually means, and to assess the numbers, and there's other things going on. And really what it does is it complicates matters. So it gets us away from what's always been assumed and allows us to look at the details of what's going on, and to look how things like Enlightenment, is what he's interested in, had a particular impact within the English Benedictines. As I said, that's just a really quick overview, and to give you an idea how we can use those different materials. As I said, what I really want to get away from is that the idea of a prosopographical database, so one that's recording individuals, which can seem like only a starting step, and in some ways it is. It's a problem we've had with these English exile institutions. The same, I know, with the Irish Catholic exile institutions that, for example, Thomas O'Connor's been doing work on. But to get away that it's just an idea of number counting and nerdy collecting, that this is to show why it matters, and what it feeds into in wider debates and what we can do with it. And there's a lot of scope that we can do with that. So thank you very much for listening.